Hello and welcome to the Columbia Museum of Art. Today we're going to be touring Black is Beautiful, the photography of Kweme Brathwaite. And I'll be your tour guide. I'm Glenna Barlow, the Senior Manager of Education and Interpretation here at the CMA. Let's go. All right, welcome. So as we said, this exhibition is called Black is Beautiful. You've probably heard that phrase somewhere before, and if you have, it might be in part because of this person right here. This is Kweme Brathwaite, and he, along with his brother Alambe, really helped to kind of popularize that phrase back in the 1960s, when a lot of these photographs date to. So let's tell you a little bit more about who Kweme was first, and what this exhibition is really all about. So Black is Beautiful was really to capture this idea that there was something beautiful and something to be proud of in being Black. And, it's kind of odd to think now that that was a controversial statement, that they really wanted to proclaim that Black is indeed beautiful. So that meant everything from supporting Black-owned businesses to being proud of the way that you looked and the way that you styled your hair and you showed your personality through your clothing. So Kweme Brathwaite was really all about promoting that idea of Black is beautiful. And he and his brother Alambe really kind of put their money where their mouth was in terms of that, because they were not just talking about this idea, but they organized jazz shows, they organized fashion shows and helped to get those off the ground. They were really instrumental and really active in this movement. So as I said, this was back in the 1960s in Harlem, so up in the Bronx. And really, Kweme Brathwaite was instrumental in not just organizing, but also photographing and documenting these things that were happening. So that ran the gamut, everything from fashion shows and jazz concerts to picketing and politics. And he did that through his chosen medium, which is photography. So here we get a rare self-portrait. Usually photographers kind of like to be behind the camera, but in this case we get a beautiful shot of Kweme himself. And we can see the tool of his trade. This is his Hasselblad medium format camera that he used. And as you'll know, this is no digital camera, right? This is back in the day of film. So he had to be very intentional about the work that he did. And indeed, this shot gives us a real glimpse into how he worked, right? This shows us a little bit about his process and his technique. So if you'll notice, his hand is on the shutter and one on this side of the image. But if we look over here to his expression, look at the way his eyes are really focused in on his subject. Even look at his mouth, how it's just slightly open. His hand is outstretched, almost as if you can tell he's just waiting for that perfect shot. He's just anticipating it. And that's really how he operated. He wouldn't just take a bunch of shots and hope that something would work out. He waited, and he waited until the subject maybe got used to his presence, or until something moved and came into the frame just right before he got that image. And it was because of that process that he was able to give us these wonderful photographs that really humanized the Black is Beautiful movement and really showed us the human element behind all of these big ideas. So I hope that you'll join me in enjoying the rest of the images that we'll see in this exhibition, all the work of Kweme Brathwaite. So this photo, I absolutely love this photo because it's such a beautiful and masterful example of Kwame photography. And the reason for that has a lot to do with composition. So before we get into this, I want you to discuss, what is composition? What does that mean? And what does it mean for photography specifically? So pause here and discuss composition. Okay. So composition is basically all about how the different elements of art are arranged. So when we say elements of art, of course, we're thinking about things like line, shape, color, those kinds of elements that are inherent to all works of art, right? But composition is how they're arranged. Now, if you are an artist who uses paper and pencil, who is painting, who is, drawing, composition looks a little different, right? You can plan out every element and exactly where it's going to be. You have total control over that, right? With photography, it's a little bit different. Now, you can stage exactly how you want a photograph to look, right? You can put all of these different objects in exactly the right spots. You can light them just how you like. But if you're taking a candid photograph, so one that you didn't stage or didn't pose, it's going to be a little different, right? There's an element of chance that you just have to kind of go with the flow on. So if you're a photographer and you're thinking about composition, it's all about framing your shot, getting it in just the right spot. And then sometimes it's about waiting for that perfect moment when you hit the shutter and you get that perfect shot. So that's what Kwame does so beautifully here. So let's talk about this composition. And first, I want to think about something we call the focal point. So what is your eye drawn to first in this image? So take a good look, and let's pause right here. What is your eye drawn to right away when you first saw this image? Okay. So probably some of you, when you discussed this piece and kind of thought about where your eye was drawn, you probably noticed the pipe here, right? And the smoke coming out of it. And why is that? Why does our eye go to that spot? Well, there's a couple of reasons, right? First, it's kind of in the middle, so our eyes are usually drawn to something that's central, right? But also there's this nice contrast between the lightness of the smoke and the dark background. If that pillar there was a little bit lighter, we really wouldn't see the smoke as much, right? It wouldn't show up. But because those values are different enough, there's high contrast, and so we're able to see the smoke. It really stands out, right? So that's just one element of the image though, right? We don't just look at the middle. Our eye moves all around this composition. And why is that? Well, there's a couple of different elements going on too. So again, when we think about contrast, we've got these lights here up at the top. There's this kind of bright white against this very dark background, this kind of shadowy area at the top. So the brightness of those lights really stands out. But there's not just one, there's a number of lights, and they have this regular sort of pattern that moves our eye around the image. When we have that, we sometimes call that rhythm. So even though, we think about that in music, we use that same term in art because it gives this sense of a pattern and kind of a rhythm that moves throughout the image. So it's that same idea. So we've got that kind of visual interest drawing our eye throughout the composition of the piece. But what about this figure here in the foreground? Well, he's the biggest thing because, of course, he's closest to us. So he's sort of the biggest element of this image. He's also in focus. So that's one other kind of technique you can use in photography where something is in focus and other things aren't, right? So this figure here, he's in focus. Everything else is a little bit blurry. So that's clearly what our photographer wants you to key on, right? But not only is he in focus, is he bigger, but he's making this wonderful kind of triangular or pyramidal shape with his arm and his shoulder and just the way he's framed perfectly in this image. So that lends that sense of kind of dynamism or movement where our eye is moving all over the image. And then there's one last thing that's kind of unique to photography that I want to talk about in terms of composition. You may have heard this before. It's called the rule of thirds. We talk about this a lot with photography. It's basically just this idea that you can break up an image into thirds, and you can kind of imagine these as different quadrants, either horizontally or vertically. And you want to put things that are on those in-between lines, those imaginary lines of the thirds of your image. Just because if something's always dead center, it's not always as visually interesting as putting it just a little bit off to the side. So we've got this pole at the edge of this kind of structure here that gives us one of those implied kind of imaginary lines. The blackness or that darkness of the top area, the ceiling, gives us that sense of, a third of the image. So he's really breaking up this composition with all of those different elements. And he's doing that all without using color, right? So this is a monochromatic image. Of course, that means one color, right? And that seems misleading because it looks like there's black, there's white, there's shades of gray. But really, if we want to get technical, all of those black and white and shades of gray, those are all different values along the same spectrum. So it's really just kind of one color, but different versions of it, lighter or darker. So he's using this monochromatic black and white imagery. Now, Kweme Brathwaite doesn't always shoot in black and white. So why do you think he would make that choice? He said that he thought black and white was the best choice and made the most sense for him when he was shooting jazz. So musicians and jazz clubs, he thought that just really embodied the sensibility of jazz music. But why do you think that is? So before we leave this image, I want you to discuss why you think he chose to photograph jazz and these kinds of images in black and white rather than in color. So pause here, have a little discussion, and then we're going to move on and look at some of his other works. All right, so now we're going to turn our attention to this piece. This is a little bit different from what we've seen so far, and that this is kind of what we call street photography. So this is a candid shot that Kwame took. This is up in Harlem, which is in the Bronx. That's where he grew up and where he spent a lot of his time, certainly where a lot of these photographs were taken. So before we dive into this image and I tell you a little bit more about it, I want you to start by discussing what you think is going on in this picture. And as you do, I want you to think about the details that you see. So really look closely at the whole image, look for details, and think about what do you see that makes you say that's what's going on. So pause here and have a little discussion about what's going on in this image. And then we'll come back and we'll discuss together. Okay, so hopefully you picked up on a couple of things in your discussion. So a few things here I want to point out. So first, up at the top, it says wigs Parisian. So that's interesting. We see some figures down here. They're wearing these kind of sandwich signs that we might associate with a protest or a demonstration. We've got some passersby. We've got the details of the storefront here, so some of the decorative elements, and then other objects that are kind of framing the image. So what we see here is basically a protest or a demonstration in front of a wig shop. So why would a wig store be a site of protest? Well, it's all about the place and the context of this wig store. So if we're thinking about wigs Parisian, that's already giving us kind of a European sensibility, right? So the idea here is that these wigs, which featured straight hair, really relaxed, very typical European or westernized kind of hairstyles, were being marketed to Black audiences, right? So Black women were the target audience for this store, yet it was owned and operated by two white men. And so the implication for the people protesting was that this Eurocentric or this kind of westernized view of what's seen as beautiful or ideal is straight hair, and that's what was being thrust upon the public here, and even in this largely African-American neighborhood, right? And so these women here were protesting that fact. They were saying, no, my natural hair is beautiful. I don't need to cover it up with something that looks more Western or it looks straighter or looks a certain way. My hair, just as it is beautiful. And that's really what this Black is beautiful mantra is all about. So along with that Black is beautiful idea, there was this notion of think Black, buy Black. So this is another kind of phrase that people were throwing around at the time. And that works on a couple of different levels, right? On a practical level, it means support Black-owned businesses, keep money in the community to try to support Black individuals who were, trying to make it work and running these businesses. But it also means kind of think Black and present yourself in a way that shows your pride in being Black. So that meant wearing your hair naturally. It might have different implications about fashion as well, and we're going to see some more of those as we move on. But before we leave this piece, I want to leave you with another question. And this goes back to the idea about composition. So I wonder what you think about this composition. Why do you think Kwame framed this photo the way he did? So think about the way he's shot the street, the different elements that are included. And in particular, I'm curious about this parking meter here. Why do you suppose he incorporated this parking meter here in the foreground? As we see, it's not in focus, even though it's the closest object to us. What's in focus is back here. This is what he wants us to key on, and yet he's included this element here. So pause for a moment and discuss why you think he might have chosen this composition. What implications might that have had? And now that we've discussed that a little bit, I want to throw some other ideas out at you. So you probably had a lot of great ideas about why Kwame chose to compose the piece this way. Here are some ideas that I've heard that I thought were really interesting. So first of all, the idea of a parking meter has some certain inherent kind of notions that go along with it, right? So there's this idea of time's up. So maybe there's a notion of, we've endured this kind of thing for too long. But then also just in a more kind of visceral way, it really brings us into the moment, right? It kind of roots us in the scene, on the street, where kind of it feels like we're there. So there are all these elements and aspects to that one inclusion that might make us think differently a little bit about this image. So just some food for thought on why you think the composition might look the way it does. All right, so here we have two wonderful images of Kwame's work, and I love these two together because they really show kind of two sides of the way that he worked. So first we're going to take a look at this one briefly, and this is a great illustration of the way that Kwame, he shot beautiful works of art, but he also, his photographs also serve to document what was going on in this particular time, in this particular place. And so in that case, the time and place is the 1960s in Harlem or in the Bronx in New York City. So you can probably tell just by looking at this that something's going on kind of, over here off camera. Everyone's facing this certain way. There's all different kinds of people here. They're dressed in different ways, but they're all interested in what's going on. So as you might have guessed, this is a demonstration. This is a celebration. Something's happening over here, right? So this is actually an example of Marcus Garvey Day. So if you haven't heard of Marcus Garvey, take a moment, have a discussion, look up who Marcus Garvey is. But basically, he was born in Jamaica, he was an activist, and he traveled around the US really promoting the idea of racial pride and self-sufficiency among the Black community. That meant economic independence, things like that. So Marcus Garvey Day was a way to celebrate his life and legacy after he passed away. And Carlos Cooks in New York really kind of took up the mantle of Marcus Garvey after he passed on. And so Carlos Cooks became really influential, especially for Kweme Brathwaite and his brother Alambe. They really felt deeply in and believed in what he was saying. And a lot of what he was saying was this whole think Black, buy Black kind of mantra. So think Black means be concerned about these events and these issues that affect you and the rest of the Black community. But it also meant, take pride in your appearance and in being, just really celebrating what it meant to be Black in a really broad sense. And so that's kind of what this image is getting at. It's really documenting that kind of moment in time. Another side of that coin of the think Black mentality is on display here. So in this case, it means think Black and present yourself as someone who's proud of being Black. And so you can do that in a number of ways, right? So this, for a lot of folks who were really living this and really embodying this kind of lifestyle, that meant calling attention to things like your hairstyle, so wearing your hair naturally, the way you wore your clothing, the clothes that you wore, headdresses. If you think about it, clothes tell us a lot about a person, right? So for instance, my clothes today tell you that I really like color. They might tell you that I like to be comfortable. I like to buy secondhand clothes. I'm around art supplies a lot. So the things that you wear can kind of send a message to the world about who you are. It might say something about, a sports team that you support or a cause that's really important to you. So take a moment, reflect on, what your clothes say about you. What are you wearing today? What does that tell the world about who you are? But this is that same idea, right? So the three women here, they're all wearing beautiful clothing that's traditional to different African places. And I want to call attention to that specifically. So if you look really closely, these all have beautiful patterns, but they're all very different, right? Even the draping, the kind of silhouettes of the outfits, they're all different. The headwear, so the hair wraps or the natural hairstyles, those are all different as well. So this is really a photo that's showcasing in a posed kind of traditional style photograph, but it's really showcasing the individual beauty and diversity of these different styles. And this is all going back to what's called the naturally fashion shows. So this is another big part of that Think Black, Buy Black movement. Definitely a big part of the Black is Beautiful movement as a whole. So these naturally fashion shows were really meant to celebrate and highlight traditional African styles of clothing, natural hair, really just celebrating the fact that Black women who wore their hair naturally could be beautiful. That may not sound that radical today, but back then there was this really overwhelming notion that you had to straighten your hair. You had to relax your hair in order to be thought of as traditionally beautiful. And they were really bucking against that notion. So this was really kind of a radical act, even though it's one that's really celebratory. So they did that not just in wearing their hair naturally, but in choosing particular styles that called attention to or that highlighted different aspects of cultures throughout Africa. Because even today, there's this misconception that Africa is just one big monolith. It's all the same. That could not be further from the truth, right? We know that Africa is a huge continent. It's incredibly diverse. And so during these fashion shows, they would actually call out different hairstyles that referenced places like a certain subgroup in Ethiopia, or cosmopolitan fashions from places like Nairobi and these cosmopolitan, really modern cities in Africa that people maybe didn't realize were as contemporary and as dynamic as they were. So this is really a way to celebrate those different kinds of styles and fashions. But also, I want us to note the setting, because he did not just shoot this photograph anywhere. This is in a gallery that's showcasing works of African art and sculpture. So on either side of the models here, kind of flanking them, we get these beautiful examples of artwork that we can trace back to different parts of the African continent. And this was actually in the Merton Simpson Gallery up in New York. Merton Simpson's a really interesting guy in and of himself. He's from South Carolina, and he opened this gallery as a way to really showcase and really promote art from Africa. So he was really instrumental in helping a lot of museums set up African art departments. They didn't have collections of African art, so he was really promoting the sale and acquisition of African sculptures and works like this. And so he's showcasing the beauty of these works of art, and also calling out these women as kind of works of art in of themselves, the fashions that they wear. All of that artwork comes together in this piece. And even if we notice, there's really subtle ways the models kind of frame the pieces that they're next to, just by really subtle poses and ways that they've moved their bodies to kind of accentuate and highlight the space that they're in and the artwork that they're among. So this is a really important part of that whole Black is Beautiful idea. And we see those beautiful styles on display in some of the other images of the fashion shows that Kweme Brathwaite took. So we'll see a few of those in just a moment. So here we have another shot of the Naturally Fashion show that we just talked about. So these are some of the Grandassa models, and they call themselves that because of this word Grandassa land. That actually comes from Carlos Cooks, who we just talked about a moment ago. He used Grandassa land to be sort of an imagined idea of the African continent. So just really referencing that notion of Africa and Pan-Africanism, which is that idea that even though Africa is a really big, diverse place, there's this kind of shared identity among people who are part of the African diaspora, who came from Africa or whose ancestors did. So this idea of Grandassa land was really, they kind of took that on, and these models called themselves the Grandassa models. So this is another just kind of element of pride and celebrating, African culture. And of course, we get color here now. This is the first time we've seen some color photos from Kwame. So you can imagine why he would have wanted to shoot these in color, right? We can see all of the beautiful bright tones in the garments that the models are wearing. The gorgeous blue of the wall, they really stand out against that. And we really get a wonderful sense of the variety that we would have seen in these Naturally Fashion shows, right? We talked about how they were celebrating different fashions and traditions and styles from different parts of the African continent. But if you look closely, you'll also see that they're referencing some kind of contemporary 60s fashion that you might have seen in the US as well. Why did they do that? Well, they really wanted these fashion shows to inspire people. They didn't just want them to educate, although that was part of it. They wanted them to be inspired to feel empowered to dress a certain way, to really embrace their African heritage, and to do that by infusing styles with things they were already wearing. So if you look at this image, can you see any details or elements that remind you of what you think of when you think of 60s fashion? You could pause and discuss that here. But yeah, you've got these bright floral kind of prints. You've got these beautiful sort of pastel, but really bright, like dialed up tones. So all of that is right at home with what we would think of when we think of 60s fashion in the US. But we also have these beautiful African prints. We have head wraps. Again, natural hair, of course. These are the naturally fashion shows. And Kwame photographs this in such a way that it's a dynamic image, even though it's just models who are posed. The way he's arranged them, right? He's got them kind of from tallest to shortest. They're all standing with their legs out forward. And just the way he's kind of framed this shot with the lines that you see coming on the top and the bottom, it gives it this sense of kind of forward momentum. So even with kind of a straightforward image like this one, Kwame's really thoughtful, and he's really intentionally framing and composing this image to give you a sense of what these fashion shows were really all about. Okay, so here we're in between two very different but great images that give us a beautiful illustration of how Kweme Brathwaite and Olambe Brath kind of work together and use their particular skills and strengths to highlight the Black is Beautiful movement. So here we've got this wonderful image of a lot of our Grandasa models. Again, we have a color image, so you can see all of the beautiful bright colors, the posters in the background. And this really gives us a nice kind of overview of the different types of folks who were a part of this movement. I want to especially highlight the women here because they don't fit with that typical 60s fashion tradition of having really waifish and stick-thin models. So if you think of someone like Twiggy, that was really kind of the aesthetic of the 1960s if we think about fashion. So these women, while none of them are what we would consider plus size today, they really illustrate this kind of variety and diversity in terms of body styles and body shapes. And so that was a really important part of the movement as well, in addition to things like natural hair and different styles of clothing. So we get a great idea of that. We also have different skin tones, and that was an important part of this movement as well. We've got our male models here at the bottom as well. We don't want to forget them. And they're also carrying some different publications. That was a part of Kwame's brother, Olambe's work. So if we look over here, we'll see a nice example of some of his poster designs. So while Kwame was studying photography in art school, Olambe was turning his attention to design. So design is really all about trying to solve a problem in a creative way, right? So in this case, the problem is, how do you get the word out about these events? They've taken the time to, start a jazz club, to create these fashion shows, to really organize a movement. You have to let people know about them, right? And to do that, you have to catch their attention. And if it's something like a poster, it has to be something that's really going to catch your eye as you're just walking down the street. So how do they do that? What are the different kind of techniques or patterns or styles that you notice in these different images? You can see they're from, different years, so they're from some different time periods within this movement. But pause here and discuss what you think some of the trends and techniques that you notice are, and why do you think that Olambe might have made those choices? So some of the things you might have picked up on are, there's a lot of use of black, right? That makes sense. Black is beautiful. Black is going to be a central part of that idea, but also black is going to really stand out. So we talked about contrast before. Black on something like white or on a lighter background is really going to pop, right? But then we also have these beautiful typefaces. So those add a little bit of an element of style to it. For instance, this title here, Naturally 74, how does the naturally have a different kind of tone than the 74? Just in shifting the use of font or typeface, we get a very different feel. So it kind of sets a different tone or mood for what this event is going to be based on, the ways that they incorporate graphics, the ways that they're using fonts or lettering, and the colors and styles that they're using. So two brothers who were very invested in the Black is Beautiful movement, but who used their skills to highlight it in different ways. So here we have some really incredible examples of Kwame's work. As you can tell, the scale is pretty big, and we have what we might call studio photography. So in contrast to something like street photography or candid photography, this is something that's definitely posed and prepared for, There's a lot of care taken into consideration of things like the background, the lighting, the way everything is staged, and it's really meant to showcase the model as well as what she's wearing. So in this case, of course, the focus is on this beautiful headdress. So this is a piece that was created by Carolee Prince. She's a designer who created a lot of headdresses like this one. In fact, she created some that were worn by Nina Simone during some of her performances. So she was pretty high profile. And she created a lot of pieces for the Grandassa models for these naturally fashion shows. So that's kind of the showpiece and what we're showcasing in this image. But think also about the choices that Kwame has made as the photographer. So for instance, the background color, this really warm, rich kind of honey tone. Why do you think he might have chosen that color? Well, it kind of brings out the tones in her skin. It makes her skin almost seem to glow. It really works beautifully with her complexion. It still gives us enough contrast that we can really see the piece that she's wearing as well as the earrings, again, against the darker color of her skin. So we get that nice sense of contrast. Let's turn our attention to the model's expression. So she's sort of looking downward, right? She's not looking back at us, but I would argue it's not in a way that's deferential. She still looks poised and composed and dignified. So I wonder what sense you get from looking at this image, thinking about her expression, thinking about this beautiful headdress here. What sort of tone do you think is conveyed? What kind of emotion or feeling was the model trying to express? So press pause here and you can discuss that. What do you think this model was trying to tell us through her expression? So now that you've had a moment to discuss that, I want to tell you also this model just happens to be Kweme Brathwaite. So that's Kweme Brathwaite's wife. And she herself is a pretty incredible woman. She was one of the Grandassa models. She, like many of the models, created some of the garments that she wore. She was also an activist and continues to be an activist in terms of issues that are really relevant to the Black experience and her Black community. But she ended up marrying Kweme Brathwaite, and she herself is from South Carolina. So we've got another hometown connection in this image of Kweme Brathwaite. So here we have kind of a similar example. This is actually the same model. This is Kweme Brathwaite again. And we've got another kind of polished studio kind of shot. But there are some notable differences, right? For one thing, the background color is different. So there's some intentionality around which pieces are going to look best with which colors. We've got more of an emphasis on the garment. And, of course, that headdress that we saw before is no longer there. But the model is also looking upward this time, right? Her gaze is not downward anymore. She's looking straight ahead. And I'm curious again about what you feel about her expression. What kind of sensibility is that conveying to you? So pause here and discuss how you think her expression has shifted and perhaps what she's trying to convey in this image and how that might differ from the last one that we saw. So another important difference here, I think, is the real emphasis on the natural hairstyle, right? This is a showpiece. This is a cornerstone of the naturally fashion shows and the Grandassa models in general. And there's this notion that hair is like a crown, right? And certainly I think Kweme's expression also fits with that idea of nobility, this kind of regal look that she has, really goes nicely with this notion of hair being a crown and a celebration of power and beauty. And to me, it really reminds me of one of the pieces in our collection from Tyrone Jeter. He's a local South Carolina artist, and a lot of his work incorporates headwear, whether that's hats or hoodies or hairstyles that have this sense of power. And to me, Kweme Brathwaite is giving the same sensibility to Kweme, especially in the way that she herself has fixed her expression and really embodied that idea. So this, to me, celebrates an important part of the Black is Beautiful movement, not just the hairstyle, but the clothing as well. So Kweme and a lot of the other Grandassa models would actually create some of their own garments. So if we move forward here just a little bit, you'll see some examples of the actual clothing that they wore during these fashion shows. So as you can see, they vary widely. The image here to your left is really modeled after a dress that Sophia Loren wore on The Tonight Show. This is very contemporary 60s kind of fashion in terms of the pattern, the color scheme, the overall design. But then images and objects like this one reference more traditional African fabric techniques, even though they're made using modern and contemporary materials from the 1960s. But often the Grandassa models actually fabricated and designed these garments themselves. So they really took to heart this notion of pride and really empowering themselves as part of the Black community and really celebrating the notion of Black is beautiful in the clothes that they wore and the way they styled their hair and the way they were photographed and in the ways they supported the community that they lived in. So I hope you've enjoyed this look into Kweme Brathwaite and his work, Black is Beautiful, in this exhibition. We've loved having you here at the Columbia Museum of Art. Even though you couldn't be here in person, we hope that you'll come back soon and come see us. Thank you so much.